The building started shaking, but my boss locked us inside, said, "Finish the presentation first, then panic." The fluorescent lights were swinging. That's what I noticed first, before my brain processed what the swinging meant, before the sound of groaning steel registered, before I understood that the floor beneath my feet was moving in a way floors should absolutely never move. I was standing at the front of the conference room on the 18th floor of the Westmark Tower, laptop open, PowerPoint slide projected on the screen behind me, talking about Q4 projections and market penetration strategies, when the lights started swaying like pendulums and everything in the room that wasn't bolted down began sliding east. My coffee mug tipped over, laptop skidded across the table, and Gregory Hartwell, my boss, the regional vice president of operations, who'd called this emergency meeting on a Saturday morning, stood up from his chair at the head of the conference table and did the last thing any rational human being should do during an earthquake. He walked to the conference room door and locked it from the inside. I'd been working for Hartwell and the company, Paramount Solutions, a mid-tier consulting firm that sold enterprise software to corporations with more money than sense, for 3 years and 8 months. Long enough to know that Gregory Hartwell was demanding, obsessive about metrics, and had a reputation for pushing his teams harder than any other VP in the company. Long enough to know that he'd canceled vacations, ruined holidays, and made people cry in performance reviews. But I'd never seen him do anything that suggested he was genuinely, dangerously unhinged. That changed when he turned the deadbolt on that conference room door while the building was actively shaking beneath us, looked at the 8 of us frozen in various states of panic, and said in his usual clipped corporate tone, "Everyone sit down. We're finishing this presentation. Then we can address whatever that noise is." The shaking had already lasted maybe 10 seconds at that point, which doesn't sound like much until you're experiencing it, until you're watching the world violate its most fundamental promise, that solid things stay solid. The building groaned again, a deep, metallic sound like a ship's hull under stress, and I felt the floor drop slightly beneath my feet before catching again. Kevin Marsh, one of the senior analysts, was already halfway out of his chair, face pale, saying something about getting to the stairwell. Allison Park, our project coordinator, had her phone out, probably trying to call someone. Michael Torres, the new guy who'd only been with the company 6 weeks, looked like he was going to be sick. And Gregory Hartwell stood in front of the locked door with his arms crossed and this expression on his face that I can only describe as irritated patience, like we were children having a tantrum over bedtime. He said, "I understand everyone's concerned, but we've all lived here long enough to know these tremors happen. This building is engineered to withstand them. What it can't withstand is another quarter of missing our targets because this team can't focus for 90 minutes. So, sit down. We have 16 slides left, and we're going through every single one before anyone leaves this room." Kevin said something about evacuation protocols. Allison said something about the law requiring us to exit during seismic events. Michael just stood there staring at the door like he was calculating whether he could physically move Gregory out of the way. And I stood at the front of the room with my finger still hovering over the spacebar on my laptop, the slide behind me reading Customer Retention Strategies, Q4 Implementation Timeline, trying to process whether this was really happening or if I'd somehow slipped into a fever dream. The shaking stopped. The sudden stillness was almost worse than the movement because it meant we had to decide what happened next without the immediate physical threat forcing the decision. Gregory looked at each of us in turn, his face completely calm, and repeated his command. "Sit. Down. Now." And here's the thing about corporate conditioning, about 3 years of having your performance reviewed, and your bonus determined, and your career trajectory controlled by someone. Even when your rational brain is screaming that you're in danger, even when every instinct says run, there's this other part of you that's been trained to comply with authority figures in business casual. So we sat, all of us. We sat back down at that conference table on the 18th floor of a building that had just experienced a significant earthquake, and Gregory Hartwell nodded once with satisfaction and told me to continue with the presentation. I'd been with Paramount Solutions since graduating with my MBA, recruited during the standard corporate cattle call that happens every spring at decent business schools. The job had seemed fine at first. Good salary, reasonable benefits, the usual promises about growth potential and professional development. I'd started as a junior consultant, moved up to senior consultant within 18 months, and was supposedly on track for a management position by year 5. The work was mind-numbing corporate strategy stuff, helping other companies optimize their internal processes or implement our software solutions, but it paid my student loans and rent on a decent apartment downtown. Gregory Hartwell had been my direct supervisor for 2 years, ever since he'd transferred from the Chicago office to take over the Western region. Everyone who worked under Gregory had stories. There was the time he'd made Allison redo a client presentation 11 times because the font kerning wasn't consistent across slides. There was the time he'd called Kevin at 2 a.m. to discuss a typo in an email sent to a prospective client. There was the mandatory weekend strategy session he'd scheduled during someone's wedding, forcing them to choose between career and personal life. But those were just extreme corporate horror stories, the kind everyone in consulting or finance or law has, proof that you're working somewhere that takes itself seriously. Nobody thought Gregory was dangerous, just intense, just committed to excellence in a way that sometimes crossed lines of basic human decency. If you are enjoying this story already, Please subscribe to see more stories like this. The emergency Saturday meeting had been called with 36 hours notice. Email sent Thursday afternoon, subject line, mandatory Q4 strategy session, all team members required. Saturday, 9 a.m., conference room C, 18th floor. Bring your laptops and your quarterly performance data. No exceptions, no excuses. I'd had plans, nothing major, just errands and maybe meeting some friends for lunch, but mandatory meant mandatory with Gregory, so I'd shown up at 8:55 wearing business casual and carrying my work laptop and a very large coffee. The 8 of us on his direct team had assembled around the conference table. Me, Kevin, Allison, Michael, plus Rebecca Sutton, James Nolan, Lisa Kim, and David Fisher. All of us wondering why this couldn't have happened during normal business hours, none of us willing to ask. Gregory had started the meeting with his usual intensity, laying out his expectations for Q4, explaining how we were currently tracking below targets in 3 key metrics, detailing exactly how each of us had personally contributed to those shortfalls. He'd gone through our individual performance reviews with brutal precision, using hard numbers and unflattering comparisons. Then, he'd handed the floor over to me to present the Q4 strategy I'd been developing for the past 3 weeks, the plan that was supposed to get us back on track. I'd been maybe 20 minutes into my presentation, covering market analysis and competitive positioning, when the shaking started. Now we were sitting in artificial stillness, pretending the laws of physics hadn't just reminded us how fragile our high-rise corporate fortress actually was, and Gregory was telling me to advance to the next slide. I looked at my laptop screen. I looked at the door, still locked. I looked at Kevin, who was gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles were white. Then I looked back at Gregory and said, very carefully, that maybe we should take a brief pause to assess the situation and make sure the building was safe. Gregory's expression didn't change. He said, "The building is safe. It was constructed in 2015 to the highest seismic standards. These tremors are common in this region, and the Westmark Tower has weathered dozens of them without incident. What's not safe is our Q4 trajectory, if we waste time on unnecessary panic. Next slide." Now. Allison tried again. She said that company policy required evacuation during any seismic event until the building was cleared by safety personnel. She even pulled out her phone and started reading from the employee handbook she'd apparently downloaded. Gregory cut her off mid-sentence. He said that policy was a guideline for typical business hours when evacuation might cause chaos with hundreds of employees. There were 8 of us. We were in a controlled environment. We were staying put until the presentation was complete. And if anyone had a problem with that, they could discuss it with HR on Monday morning, after they explained why they'd prioritized their own comfort over team commitments. The threat was clear. Gregory had the power to make our lives miserable, to tank our performance reviews, to derail our careers. And he was willing to use that power to enforce compliance with something that was objectively insane. I watched the calculation happen on everyone's faces. How much was their immediate safety worth versus their long-term employment? How real was the danger versus how real were the consequences of defying him? Corporate America had trained us to make exactly this kind of cost-benefit analysis, and we were making it even though the costs included potential death and the benefits were keeping a middle management tyrant happy. I advanced to the next slide. Customer retention strategies. Phase 1, implementation. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and mechanical, as I talked about CRM system integration and touchpoint optimization, while my hands trembled slightly on the laptop keyboard. The words were meaningless. The whole presentation was meaningless. We were sitting in a potentially compromised building, locked in a room by a man who valued quarterly targets over human safety, and I was discussing software deployment timelines like any of it mattered. Rebecca, who'd been quiet until now, raised her hand like we were in school. She said, "Gregory, I'm feeling really uncomfortable about staying in the building. Can I at least go check on the situation in the lobby?" Gregory didn't even look at her. He said, "No. You can check on the situation in 90 minutes when we're done here." Rebecca sat back in her chair, defeated. James started to say something, stopped, started again, then just shook his head and stared at his laptop. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, and I realized we were all individually making the decision to comply rather than unite and force the door open. That's what Gregory was counting on. Individual fear of consequences overwhelming collective action. I kept presenting. Talked through Phase 1 implementation timelines, resource allocation, expected ROI metrics. My brain was running on autopilot, pulling from the dozens of similar presentations I'd given over the years, while another part of my mind kept listening for any sound from outside the conference room. Were people evacuating? Were alarms going off that we couldn't hear? Had there been damage to other parts of the building? The windows behind me showed the city skyline, unchanged and placid, giving no indication that anything was wrong. Just another Saturday morning in the metro area, except we were locked in a room with a man who apparently believed PowerPoint presentations trumped survival instinct. Then, the aftershock hit. Smaller than the first quake, but somehow more terrifying, because now we knew what it was. Now we had no excuse of confusion or surprise. The building swayed, a sickening lateral motion that made my stomach lurch, and something outside the conference room crashed with the sound of shattering glass. The lights flickered. Rebecca screamed, short and sharp. Kevin was on his feet again, And this time, so was Michael, and both of them were moving toward the door, toward Gregory, clearly done with compliance. Kevin said, "We're leaving, right now. Move away from the door, or I'm moving you myself." His voice had an edge I'd never heard before, something primal pushing through the corporate polish. Michael nodded, backing him up, and for a second I thought it was going to work. Thought Gregory would recognize he'd pushed too far and step aside. But Gregory didn't move. He planted his feet, put his back against the door, and when he spoke, his voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm, which made the words even more chilling. He said, "If anyone touches me, that's assault. If anyone tries to open this door against my direct order, that's insubordination. Both are fireable offenses and potentially criminal. This building is not in danger. You are not in danger. What you are is panicking over normal geological activity that happens in this region multiple times a year. I have a conference call with the executive team in 4 hours to discuss this quarter's performance, and I will not tell them that my team was too frightened to complete a basic strategy meeting. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to finish the last 14 slides. Then we're going to have a professional, thorough discussion about implementation. Then, and only then, we're going to unlock this door and leave like adults. Anyone who can't handle that level of professionalism needs to seriously reconsider whether they belong at Paramount Solutions." The aftershock ended. Kevin and Michael stood frozen halfway between the table and the door, caught between instinct and indoctrination. I saw Kevin's jaw working, saw him wrestling with the same calculation we were all making. Was this worth losing his job over? Was Gregory actually crazy enough to follow through on his threats? And underneath that, was the danger real enough to justify the career consequences? The building had stopped shaking again. We were still alive. Maybe Gregory was right, and we were overreacting. Maybe this was just a test of our commitment, our ability to stay focused under pressure, and the real disaster would be failing that test. Michael sat back down first. Then Kevin, more slowly, his face twisted with frustration and something that looked like shame. Rebecca was crying quietly, shoulders shaking. Allison had both hands wrapped around her phone like it was a lifeline. James and Lisa and David looked shell-shocked, processing the reality that we'd just collectively chosen to stay locked in a room rather than fight for our freedom. And Gregory nodded once, satisfied, and told me to continue. I don't remember the next 3 slides. I have no memory of what I said, what data I presented, what brilliant insights I shared about customer retention and market penetration. My brain had gone into some kind of dissociative state where my mouth moved and words came out, but my consciousness was somewhere else, hovering above the scene, watching 8 people perform corporate theater while their survival instincts screamed at them to run. The only thing that pulled me back to awareness was the sound of sirens outside, faint but unmistakable, and the sudden desperate hope that someone would come check the building, would find us locked in here, would force Gregory to let us go. Allison heard them too. She stood up, tentatively, like she was testing whether Gregory would physically restrain her, and moved to the windows. She looked down at the street 18 floors below and said, voice shaking, that there were fire trucks and police cars and what looked like an evacuation happening in the adjacent building. She said people were streaming out onto the street, hundreds of them, and officials in reflective vests were setting up perimeter barriers. She turned back to Gregory and said, "They're evacuating. The whole block is evacuating. We need to get out of here now." Gregory barely glanced at the window. He said, "They're evacuating because those are older buildings without modern seismic reinforcement. The Westmark Tower is different. We're different. And we're staying until this presentation is complete. Allison, sit down. You're blocking the projector." Allison stood there for another few seconds, staring at him like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, then slowly returned to her seat. The defeat in her posture made something in my chest tighten with rage and helplessness. I got through 6 more slides before I couldn't do it anymore, before the cognitive dissonance between what I was saying and what was happening became too much to sustain. I stopped mid-sentence, something about implementation phases and timeline optimization, and closed my laptop. Gregory's head snapped up. He said, "What are you doing?" I told him I was done. I was done with the presentation, done with the meeting, done with pretending this was normal or acceptable or anything other than insane. I said he could fire me if he wanted, could write me up, could do whatever corporate punishment he thought appropriate. But I wasn't continuing this presentation while the building was potentially compromised and emergency services were evacuating the surrounding area. The conference room went silent. Everyone was staring at me, and I could see hope flickering in their faces, hope that someone was finally standing up to Gregory, that maybe this would give them permission to do the same. Gregory stood up from his chair very slowly, very deliberately, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Genuine anger, not the controlled corporate frustration he usually displayed, but something deeper and more volatile. He said, "You're refusing a direct order from your supervisor? In front of witnesses? Do you understand what you're doing to your career right now?" I told him I understood perfectly, and that my career would be meaningless if I was dead, because we'd stayed in an unsafe building to finish a PowerPoint presentation. He took a step toward me, and I actually thought for a second he might physically attack me, but he stopped and just stared with this intensity that was supposed to make me back down, supposed to reassert his dominance. But something had shifted in the room. Kevin was standing again, then Allison, then Michael, Rebecca, James, Lisa, David, all of them on their feet, all of them moving toward the door in a unified mass that Gregory couldn't physically block, even if he tried. Kevin was the one who said it, voice steady, despite the adrenaline I could see making his hands shake. "Move away from the door, Gregory. We're leaving. This isn't a request." For a long moment, Gregory didn't move. He stood there with his back against the door, 8 employees advancing on him, and I could see him running the calculation in real time. How far could he push this before he crossed a line he couldn't uncross? What would corporate say if this turned into a physical altercation? What would happen to his own career if this escalated beyond his control? And I think he finally realized, in that crystalline moment of confrontation, that he'd miscalculated badly, that his authority only extended as far as our willingness to submit, and we were done submitting. He stepped away from the door, didn't say a word, just moved aside with his jaw clenched and his face rigid with suppressed fury. Kevin reached for the lock, twisted it, pulled the door open, and we found out exactly how bad things actually were. The hallway was chaos. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red. There was a crack running up the wall opposite the conference room, plaster and drywall crumbling around it. The ceiling tiles had fallen in sections, revealing ductwork and wiring. And most horrifying, the hallway was empty, completely empty. No people, no sounds of occupation, just the low hum of emergency systems and the distant wail of sirens. Everyone else in the building had evacuated. We'd been locked in that conference room, locked in by Gregory's obsession with his quarterly review, while the entire building had been cleared. Allison started running toward the stairwell. The rest of us followed, instinct finally overriding any remaining corporate conditioning. I glanced back once and saw Gregory still standing in the conference room doorway, not following, just watching us go with this unreadable expression on his face. Then I was around the corner and focused entirely on getting down 18 flights of stairs as fast as my legs could move. The stairwell was damaged. Not catastrophically. The building hadn't collapsed, wasn't going to collapse from what we could see, but there were cracks in the concrete, sections where the handrail had torn loose from the wall, places where the steps themselves had shifted slightly out of alignment. We took them 2 at a time anyway, the 8 of us thundering down floor after floor, passing abandoned floors with emergency lights flickering, passing more evidence of structural damage. Broken windows, buckled door frames, sprinkler systems that had activated and then shut off again, leaving pools of water on the landings. At the 9th floor, we caught up with a fire marshal who was doing a final sweep. He was a big guy, maybe 50, with Danielson stenciled on his reflective vest and 20 years of crisis management written in the lines around his eyes. When he saw us stumbling out of the stairwell, his expression went from professional concern to outright shock. He said, "Jesus Christ, there are people still in here? We cleared this building 40 minutes ago. What the hell were you doing up there?" Kevin, breathing hard from the sprint down 9 flights, explained in gasps that our boss had locked us in a conference room and refused to let us evacuate. Fire Marshal Danielson's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, then grim determination. He said, "Your boss locked you in? Physically prevented you from evacuating during a seismic event?" Kevin nodded. Danielson pulled out his radio and said something sharp and urgent to whoever was coordinating the emergency response, something about potential casualties and criminal negligence and needing police backup immediately. Then he turned back to us and said, "Stay with me. We're getting you out of here, and then you're going to give statements to the police. Because what you're describing isn't just stupid corporate behavior, it's a crime." We made it out of the building 6 minutes later. The lobby was a mess. Shattered glass from the decorative panels, overturned furniture, water damage from burst pipes, but structurally intact enough to navigate. Danielson led us through the debris and out through the main entrance onto the street, where the full scope of the emergency response hit us. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, at least 50 emergency personnel establishing perimeters and coordinating efforts. Hundreds of people standing behind barrier tape, office workers and residents from the surrounding buildings, all of them evacuated safely and now watching the aftermath. We were the last ones out of the Westmark Tower. The building was sealed immediately after we exited, bright yellow tape going up across the entrance, engineers in hard hats arriving to assess structural damage, and we were separated, each of us taken to different emergency personnel to give preliminary statements about what had happened. I ended up with a police detective named Robert Mills, 23 years on the force according to the introduction he gave while pulling out a notebook. He asked me to describe the events from the beginning, and I did. The earthquake, Gregory locking the door, his refusal to let us evacuate, the aftershock, the final confrontation that had freed us. Detective Mills listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across the page, his expression neutral, but his questions increasingly pointed. He asked whether Gregory had physically restrained anyone. I said no, just blocked the door and threatened career consequences. He asked whether anyone had been injured during our delayed evacuation. I said no, we'd gotten lucky. He asked whether I'd be willing to provide a formal written statement and potentially testify if charges were filed. I said absolutely. Then he asked me something that hadn't even occurred to me in the chaos. "Where is your boss now?" I realized with a jolt that I didn't know. Gregory hadn't followed us down the stairs. I hadn't seen him since we'd fled the conference room. He might still be in the building. Might still be in that conference room on the 18th floor, surrounded by structural damage and emergency lighting, alone in a building that had been condemned and sealed. I told Detective Mills this. His face went very still. He turned and called out to Fire Marshal Danielson, who was coordinating with other officials nearby. They had a quick, intense conversation that I couldn't fully hear, and then Danielson was on his radio again, and more emergency personnel were mobilizing. I learned later, much later, after everything that followed, that Gregory had indeed still been in the building. He'd remained in the conference room after we fled, apparently believing his assessment of the building's safety was more accurate than the professional emergency responders, and he'd been preparing to continue his work when the evacuation team found him. They'd had to physically escort him out, and he'd argued with them the entire way. The next several hours were a blur of statements and documentation. We were taken to a command center that had been set up in a building 3 blocks away, given water and blankets like we were refugees from a disaster zone, which I suppose we were. A woman from OSHA arrived, Christine Yang, senior safety inspector with 15 years of experience in workplace emergency protocols, and took detailed statements from each of us. She recorded our testimony, photographed our employee IDs, collected our direct contact information. She explained that what Gregory had done potentially violated multiple federal workplace safety regulations, state emergency management laws, and possibly criminal statutes regarding reckless endangerment. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. We learned the details of the earthquake as the afternoon wore on. Magnitude 5.8, epicenter 30 miles outside the city, strong enough to cause significant structural damage to older buildings and trigger mandatory evacuations across the downtown core. 3 buildings had sustained serious damage. The Westmark Tower was classified as potentially compromised pending full structural assessment, which meant it would be closed indefinitely while engineers evaluated every floor, every support beam, every critical system. No one would be allowed back inside for at least a week, possibly longer. And we learned what happened to Gregory. He was arrested 6 hours after the earthquake, charged with multiple counts of reckless endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, and willful violation of emergency safety protocols. The charges were serious, felonies carrying potential prison time, and they were based on the statements from all 8 of us, the testimony of Fire Marshal Danielson, the evacuation log showing that the building had been cleared at 10:15 a.m. while we were still locked in the conference room, and the physical evidence of the locked door and Gregory's confirmed presence in the building after the mandatory evacuation order. Paramount Solutions released a statement within 12 hours. They suspended Gregory immediately pending investigation, expressed their commitment to employee safety, assured everyone that they were cooperating fully with authorities. It was corporate damage control, carefully worded by lawyers to minimize liability while appearing appropriately concerned. What they didn't say publicly, but what we learned through internal channels, Gregory had been flagged before for safety violations. Not as extreme as this, but a pattern of ignoring protocols, pressuring employees to work through building evacuations during fire drills, demanding that people stay at their desks during severe weather warnings. The company had documented these incidents but taken no significant disciplinary action because Gregory's teams always hit their numbers, always exceeded their targets, and corporate had valued those results over safety concerns. The media got hold of the story by Sunday morning. Local news first, then picked up by regional outlets, then going viral on social media because the narrative was too perfectly outrageous to ignore. Corporate executive locks employees in conference room during earthquake to finish PowerPoint presentation. We were contacted by reporters, producers, people wanting interviews and exclusive accounts. Most of us declined. Kevin didn't. He went on camera with a local news station and told the whole story in detail, showed photos of the cracked walls and damaged stairwell we'd fled through, described Gregory's threats and the fear we'd all felt. The video went viral. Within 36 hours, it had over 2 million views across various platforms, spawned dozens of think pieces about toxic corporate culture and the commodification of human life, became a rallying point for labor advocates and workplace safety organizations. People who'd experienced similar situations, maybe not as extreme but similar in kind, started sharing their stories. The conversation expanded from one man's criminal negligence to a systemic examination of how corporations treat employees as disposable resources, how middle managers drunk on their small amount of power create cultures of fear and compliance, how quarterly targets and performance metrics can become more important than human survival. Paramount Solutions fired Gregory 3 days after the earthquake. Not suspended. Fired. Terminated for cause, no severance, no recommendations, his 20-year career with the company ending in public disgrace. They released another statement, emphasizing their commitment to safety and announcing a comprehensive review of all emergency protocols. But the damage to their reputation was severe. Clients started pulling contracts. Job candidates declined offers. Current employees started looking for other opportunities, not wanting to be associated with a company that had allowed someone like Gregory to operate unchecked for years. The structural assessment of the Westmark Tower took 11 days. Engineers found significant damage, cracked support columns on floors 12 through 20, compromised fire suppression systems, degraded elevator shafts. The building wasn't in danger of collapse, but it would require months of repairs and reinforcement before it could be reoccupied. Everyone who worked there was displaced, forced to work remotely, or relocate to temporary office spaces. For Paramount Solutions, the disruption compounded their existing crisis, accelerating the exodus of employees and clients who'd already been reconsidering their relationship with the company. The criminal case against Gregory moved forward. His lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity due to stress, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding of the severity of the situation, tried to negotiate a plea to reduce charges. The prosecutor wasn't interested. Christine Yang from OSHA had compiled a devastating case file showing Gregory's pattern of safety violations, expert testimony from structural engineers and emergency management professionals explaining exactly how reckless his actions had been, and our testimonies providing clear evidence of intent and awareness. Gregory had known we wanted to evacuate. He'd deliberately prevented it. He'd done so while in full knowledge that a significant earthquake had occurred and that standard protocols required immediate evacuation. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out, but it never got that far. 3 months after the earthquake, Gregory accepted a plea deal, guilty to 1 count of reckless endangerment and 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, with the other charges dropped. He was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, 3 years supervised probation, mandatory anger management and psychological counseling, and prohibited from holding any management or supervisory position for 5 years following his release. It was a significant sentence, one that sent a clear message about the seriousness of what he'd done, and it brought a certain amount of closure to those of us who'd been in that conference room. But the consequences extended far beyond Gregory's personal punishment. OSHA used the case as a catalyst for new workplace safety guidelines, specifically addressing emergency evacuations and the limits of supervisory authority during crisis situations. Paramount Solutions became a cautionary tale in business schools and corporate training programs, an example of what happens when performance culture overrides safety culture. And for those of us who'd been locked in that room, who'd experienced the surreal horror of being trapped by corporate compliance while the building shook beneath us, it fundamentally changed how we understood the relationship between employees and employers. I left Paramount Solutions 2 months after the earthquake. So did Kevin, Allison, Michael, and Rebecca. We'd been offered retention bonuses, assurances that the company was changing, promises that what happened with Gregory was an anomaly. But none of us could shake the knowledge that the company had known about his behavior, had documented it, and had done nothing until it resulted in criminal charges and viral news coverage. That wasn't an anomaly. That was a system working exactly as designed, protecting results over people until the costs became too high to ignore. I found a new job at a smaller firm, one where the founders had explicitly built their culture around work-life balance and employee well-being. It paid slightly less than Paramount, had fewer prestigious clients, offered a less impressive title. But when I walked into the office on my first day and saw clearly marked emergency exits and posted evacuation procedures, and a staff handbook that dedicated an entire section to safety protocols, I felt something I hadn't felt in years of corporate work. Actual security. Kevin ended up starting his own consulting firm with 2 other former Paramount employees who'd been equally disgusted by what they'd witnessed. Allison went back to graduate school to get her degree in organizational psychology, specifically focused on workplace safety culture. Michael took a job at a nonprofit that advocates for workers' rights. We all stayed in touch, bonded by the shared trauma of that Saturday morning, checking in periodically to see how everyone was healing and moving forward. The lawsuit came later, filed by Leonard Shaw's brother, who was an attorney specializing in workplace safety litigation. He represented all 8 of us in a civil suit against Paramount Solutions for negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and failure to maintain a safe work environment. The company settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that was substantial enough to send another clear message about the costs of prioritizing metrics over humanity. I donated half of my settlement to workplace safety organizations, used the other half to build an emergency fund that meant I'd never again have to weigh my financial security against my physical safety, never have to choose between compliance and survival because I couldn't afford to lose a paycheck. Gregory served 11 months of his 18-month sentence before being released for good behavior. I heard through the professional network that he'd moved to a different state, changed careers entirely, now worked in a non-supervisory role at a logistics company. His LinkedIn profile was sparse, his professional history conspicuously missing his 2 decades at Paramount Solutions. He'd been erased from the industry he'd spent his career in, made into a ghost story that people told in break rooms and happy hours. Remember that guy who locked his team in during an earthquake? Remember what happened to him? Remember why we don't work for people like that anymore? I think about that morning sometimes. Think about the sound of the lights swinging, the feel of the floor dropping beneath my feet, the sight of Gregory's hand turning that deadbolt while the building groaned around us. Think about how close we came to a very different outcome. If the earthquake had been stronger, if the building had sustained more damage, if the aftershock had hit while we were still trapped on the 18th floor. Think about how we'd all made the choice to comply, individually and collectively, because 3 years of corporate conditioning had taught us to fear our boss more than we feared structural collapse. But I also think about the moment when that fear finally broke, when Kevin and Michael and all of us stood up and moved toward that door despite Gregory's threats, when we collectively decided that no job was worth dying for, no performance review mattered more than breathing. That was the moment when we reclaimed our agency, when we stopped being employees and became people again, with all the messy, non-optimal, beautifully irrational commitment to survival that people have. The thing about corporate culture is, it depends on maintaining certain illusions, that your job is your identity, that your employer's interests align with yours, that the people above you in the hierarchy have your best interests at heart. Gregory's mistake wasn't just locking us in that room. It was shattering those illusions so completely, so undeniably, that we could never believe in them again. And once you stop believing, once you see the system clearly for what it is, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the version of yourself that would have stayed in that room for all 18 floors worth of PowerPoint slides. I work in corporate America still. I wear business casual and attend meetings and send emails with professional signatures. But I know now, with absolute certainty, where the line is. I know what I'll comply with and what I'll walk away from. I know that any boss who values a presentation over an earthquake, any company that prioritizes quarterly targets over employee safety, any system that asks you to risk your life for metrics deserves to be defied, deserves to have its authority questioned and its power rejected. Fire Marshal Danielson told me something later, after all the statements and investigations and media coverage had died down. He said he'd seen a lot of disasters in his 20 years of emergency response, a lot of situations where people froze or panicked or made terrible decisions under pressure. But he'd never seen anything quite like what Gregory did. The calculated, deliberate choice to endanger people not out of panic or confusion, but out of commitment to corporate priorities. He said that level of dehumanization, that ability to see employees as nothing more than resources to be optimized, was rarer than most people thought, but more dangerous than any natural disaster. Because earthquakes eventually stop shaking. But bosses like Gregory keep finding new ways to remind you that you're expendable. The Westmark Tower reopened 8 months after the earthquake, fully repaired and reinforced to even higher seismic standards. Paramount Solutions moved back in, occupying floors 12 through 20 with a reduced staff and diminished client roster. I drove past it sometimes, looked up at those windows on the 18th floor, and felt nothing but relief that I'd never have to walk into that building again, never have to sit in a conference room and pretend that anything happening on a laptop screen mattered more than the ground staying solid beneath my feet. If you're reading this, if you're in a job where you feel pressured to sacrifice your safety or well-being or basic human dignity for metrics and targets and the approval of people who see you as a line item on a spreadsheet, I want you to know something. You don't owe them that sacrifice. You don't owe them your health, your peace of mind, your survival instinct. When the building starts shaking, literally or metaphorically, you have permission to unlock the door and walk out. You have permission to choose yourself over the company, your safety over their convenience, your humanity over their optimization. Gregory Hartwell locked us in a conference room during an earthquake because he believed a PowerPoint presentation was more important than our lives. He was wrong, and he lost everything, his career, his freedom, his reputation, because he was wrong. That's not just justice. That's a lesson. The only tragedy would be failing to learn it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.